My husband won $50 million and said he don't need me anymore. Then I bought his mansion and locked him out. The words still echoed in my mind like a cruel refrain, each syllable slicing through me with the precision of a blade. I don't need you anymore. That's what he had said, standing there in our modest living room as if it were nothing more than an offhand comment about the weather. The lottery ticket sat on the coffee table between us, a crumpled piece of paper that might as well have been a weapon for how much damage it inflicted. $50 million. Enough to change anyone's life forever, but not enough, apparently, to keep him tethered to mine. When we first met 10 years ago, Mark wasn't anything close to rich, or even comfortable for that matter. He worked 2 jobs just to make ends meet, and I was fresh out of college with dreams bigger than my bank account could handle. We fell in love over instant noodles and late-night conversations about all the things we'd do when life finally gave us a break. Back then, he promised me everything: loyalty, partnership, a future built together no matter how hard things got. I believed him. How could I not? He looked at me like I was his whole world, and I gave him every ounce of myself because I thought that was what love meant. But people change when money enters the picture. Or maybe they don't change, they just reveal who they've always been beneath the surface. Either way, winning the lottery didn't turn Mark into someone new, it simply stripped away the layers of kindness and humility I'd once mistaken for his true self. At first, he tried to play it cool, acting like the windfall wouldn't go to his head. But within weeks, the cracks began to show. New suits replaced his worn jeans. Expensive watches adorned his wrists. And then came the house, a sprawling mansion perched atop a hill overlooking the city, complete with marble floors, gold fixtures, and enough empty space to swallow us both whole. It wasn't the material things that hurt the most, though. It was the way he started looking at me, as if I were some relic from a past life he couldn't wait to leave behind. Conversations dwindled to awkward silences. Dinners became solitary affairs where we occupied opposite ends of a dining table, so large it felt like shouting across continents. Then one evening, after months of growing distance, he dropped the bombshell that shattered whatever fragile remnants of our marriage remained. I don't need you anymore, he said, his voice cold and detached. This changes everything. I stared at him, stunned into silence. My hands trembled as I reached for the lottery ticket, half expecting it to burst into flames under the weight of its betrayal. What are you saying? I managed to whisper, though deep down, I already knew. He shrugged, leaning back against the leather couch as if this were just another business meeting. You know what I mean. I can take care of myself now. Hell, I can take care of anyone I want. You're just holding me back. Holding him back. Those 3 words hit harder than anything else he'd said. All those years of supporting him, believing in him, sacrificing pieces of myself for the sake of us, and now I was nothing more than dead weight dragging him down. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not in front of him. Not while he watched me with that smug expression, already mentally tallying all the ways he could spend his newfound fortune without me around to cramp his style. That night, I packed a single suitcase and left. Not because I wanted to give him what he asked for, but because staying would have killed something inside me that I wasn't ready to lose. Pride, maybe. Or hope. Whatever it was, I clung to it fiercely as I drove away from the mansion, and from the man who had stopped seeing me as his wife long before the lottery win. Living alone again was strange. After a decade of sharing my life with someone, the silence of my tiny apartment pressed down on me like a physical weight. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the streetlights outside my window, reminded me of how small and insignificant I felt in the shadow of Mark's wealth. But anger is a curious thing. It has a way of burning brighter than sadness, hotter than despair. And as the days turned into weeks, my fury grew until it consumed me entirely. One afternoon, while scrolling aimlessly through real estate listings online, a guilty habit I'd picked up after leaving Mark, I stumbled upon something that made my heart skip a beat. There it was, the mansion. Up for sale. Apparently, Mark hadn't been content to simply live lavishly. He decided to upgrade yet again, trading the hilltop estate for something even grander. Something farther removed from the life we used to share. An idea sparked in my mind, igniting a fire I hadn't felt in months. If Mark thought he could erase me so easily, then fine. Let him think he won. But I wasn't going to let him get away with it, not completely. Without stopping to second-guess myself, I called the realtor and scheduled a viewing. Walking through the mansion for the first time since moving out felt surreal. Everything was exactly as I remembered it. the gleaming chandeliers, the polished wood floors, the gilded mirrors reflecting fragments of a life I barely recognized anymore. Yet somehow, it all felt emptier now, as though the absence of warmth and laughter had left permanent scars on the walls themselves. Still, I forced myself to focus. This wasn't about nostalgia or regret. It was about power. By the end of the week, the mansion belonged to me. I paid cash, using every penny I'd saved over the years along with a hefty loan I fully intended to repay someday. When the deed was signed and the keys were in my hand, I allowed myself a moment of triumph. For the first time since Mark's betrayal, I felt something other than pain, control. The next step was simple. I waited until he returned from wherever his extravagant lifestyle had taken him, some gala or charity event no doubt, and greeted him at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Welcome home," I said sweetly, stepping aside to let him enter. Confusion flickered across his face as he stepped inside, taking in the familiar surroundings. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his tone sharp with suspicion. "Oh, didn't your realtor tell you?" I replied, feigning innocence. "I bought the place. Consider it an investment." His jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. "Good. Let him feel what it's like to be blindsided." "You can't just," he started, but I cut him off before he could finish. "Actually, I can. See, unlike you, I read the fine print. Turns out the previous owner, that would be you, neglected to mention any restrictions on resale. So technically, this house is mine now. Which means..." I paused for dramatic effect, pulling a set of keys from my pocket and dangling them in front of him. "You're locked out." Mark's face turned red with rage, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think this is funny? You think you can buy your way into revenge?" "No," I said calmly, meeting his gaze with unwavering resolve. "I think this is justice. You took everything from me, Mark. My trust, my dignity, my belief in us. Now it's my turn." With that, I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving him standing in the foyer of the home he'd abandoned just like he'd abandoned me. As I closed the heavy wooden door behind me and turned the lock, a sense of satisfaction washed over me, one I hadn't realized I'd been craving until that very moment. But as satisfying as it was to see the shock and disbelief on his face, I knew this wasn't the end. Far from it. Owning the mansion was only the beginning. What came next would determine whether I emerged from this ordeal stronger than ever, or if Mark's toxic influence would continue to haunt me, no matter how far I tried to run. Days passed, and I settled into the mansion with a mix of trepidation and determination. It wasn't easy, living in a place filled with memories of a life I'd lost. Each room seemed to whisper reminders of happier times, taunting me with visions of what could have been if greed hadn't torn us apart. Yet despite the ghosts of the past lurking in every corner, I refused to let them dictate my present. This was my fresh start, my chance to reclaim the pieces of myself Mark had tried to discard. I spent hours redecorating, stripping the mansion of its opulent excesses and replacing them with touches that reflected who I truly was. Gone were the garish gold accents and ostentatious furnishings. In their place, soft fabrics, earthy tones, and artwork that spoke to my soul. Slowly but surely, the house began to feel less like a monument to wealth and more like a sanctuary, a space where I could heal and rediscover the person I used to be before the lottery changed everything. Meanwhile, Mark's attempts to regain access to the mansion grew increasingly desperate. He showed up unannounced at all hours, pounding on the door and shouting threats that echoed through the halls. At first, his tantrums unnerved me, dredging up old fears I thought I'd buried. But as time went on, I found strength in his weakness. Here was a man who had always prided himself on being untouchable, invincible, and yet, stripped of his money and privilege, he was nothing more than a spoiled child throwing a fit. Still, his persistence forced me to confront questions I'd been avoiding. Was revenge really worth the toll it was taking on my peace of mind? Could I ever truly move on if I continued to define myself in relation to him? These doubts gnawed at me during quiet moments, especially late at night when the mansion's vast emptiness pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. One evening, as I sat by the fireplace nursing a glass of wine, my phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from an unknown number, and my stomach churned as I debated whether to open it. Against my better judgment, I tapped the screen, revealing a photo that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of me, taken earlier that day as I walked through the garden. Beneath it, a single line of text, "You'll regret this." Fear gripped me, tightening its icy fingers around my throat. Had Mark gone too far this time? Or was this some twisted game designed to remind me that no matter how far I ran, he would always find a way to intrude? Determined not to let him win, I deleted the message and poured myself another drink. But as I stared into the flickering flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over, and that the cost of victory might be higher than I'd anticipated. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and determination. Every creak of the mansion's floorboards, every shadow cast by the moonlight streaming through the windows, felt like a potential threat. I started sleeping with my phone clutched in one hand, jumping at every notification sound, convinced it was another message from the unknown number. But nothing came, not immediately anyway. And that silence was almost worse than the harassment. It left me suspended in a state of unease, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Still, I refused to let fear dictate my life. If Mark thought he could intimidate me into backing down, he was sorely mistaken. I doubled down on making the mansion mine, pouring my energy into transforming it into a place where I could feel safe again. I hired a gardener to breathe new life into the overgrown grounds, planting flowers that bloomed in vibrant colors, reds, purples, yellows, that seemed to mock the gloom lingering at the edges of my mind. Inside, I rearranged furniture, added cozy nooks with plush chairs and soft lighting, and even installed a small library in what used to be Mark's ostentatious home office. The more I changed, the less it felt like his domain and the more it became my haven. But no matter how much I tried to focus on rebuilding, the tension between us simmered just beneath the surface. Mark didn't stop trying to reach me. He called incessantly, his voice alternating between pleading and venomous depending on the day. Sometimes, he'd leave long rambling voicemails about how we could work things out, if only I'd give him another chance. Other times, his messages were short and seething with barely contained rage. You'll see. You can't keep me out forever. It wasn't just the calls, either. Neighbors reported seeing him lurking near the property line late at night, peering through the wrought iron gates like some kind of ghost haunting the edges of my world. When I confronted him once, standing safely behind the locked gate while he glared up at me from below, he sneered, "This isn't over, Olivia. You stole what's mine. Yours." I shot back, gripping the iron bars until my knuckles turned white. You gave this house away when you decided I wasn't worth keeping around. Don't act like you care now. His expression darkened, but before he could respond, I slammed the intercom button and retreated inside, my heart pounding. For all my bravado, his words lingered in my mind, twisting themselves into insidious doubts. Had I gone too far? Was there any part of him that still cared, or was he simply lashing out because I'd taken something he valued? As the weeks wore on, I began to realize that cutting ties with Mark wasn't as simple as locking him out of the mansion. He had woven himself into the fabric of my life in ways I hadn't fully understood until he was gone. Memories of our early years together haunted me, quiet evenings spent laughing over takeout, lazy Sundays reading side by side, the way he used to hold my hand during long drives without saying a word. Those moments weren't erased just because he'd betrayed me, they were scars etched deep into my soul, reminders of what I'd lost. To distract myself, I threw myself into work. Before the lottery win, I'd been a graphic designer, freelancing from home while Mark worked long hours to make ends meet. Now, with the financial security the mansion provided, and the hefty rental income one earned by leasing out portions of it, I had the freedom to pursue projects I truly cared about. I took on pro bono work for local nonprofits, designing logos and marketing materials for causes close to my heart. It felt good to create something meaningful again, to use my skills not just for profit but for purpose. Yet even in my professional life, Mark found ways to intrude. One afternoon, as I was meeting with a client at a cafe downtown, I spotted him across the street. He was leaning against a lamppost, watching me with an unreadable expression. My stomach churned, and I quickly excused myself, hurrying back to the safety of the mansion. That night, unable to sleep, I paced the halls, replaying the encounter in my mind. What did he want? Why couldn't he leave me alone? Then came the letter. It arrived in the mail one rainy morning, slipped into the mailbox alongside bills and junk flyers. The envelope bore no return address, only my name scrawled in jagged handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper inside. At first glance, the contents seemed innocuous, a legal document detailing the terms of a settlement offer. According to the letter, Mark was willing to pay me a substantial sum, $500,000, if I agreed to vacate the mansion and relinquish all claims to it. I stared at the page, my vision blurring with anger and disbelief. $500,000. To him, it was pocket change, a pittance compared to the fortune he'd amassed. But to me it represented something else entirely, an attempt to buy his way out of accountability, to erase the damage he'd done with a check and a handshake. Did he really think I could be bought so easily? Crumpling the letter in my fist, I marched to the fireplace and tossed it into the flames. Watching it burn brought a fleeting sense of satisfaction, but it didn't erase the questions gnawing at me. What would happen if I refused his offer? Would he escalate his tactics, push harder to reclaim what he saw as rightfully his? Or was this merely a test, a way to gauge how far I was willing to go? The turning point came unexpectedly, during a charity gala hosted by one of my non-profit clients. I attended reluctantly, uncomfortable in the sleek black dress I'd purchased specifically for the occasion. The event was held in a grand ballroom adorned with crystal chandeliers and overflowing flower arrangements, the kind of opulence that reminded me too much of Mark's world. As I mingled awkwardly among the crowd, sipping champagne and nodding politely at conversations I barely followed, I caught sight of him across the room. Mark looked different tonight, not the disheveled desperate man who prowled the edges of my property, but someone polished and poised, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed wealth and power. He moved through the crowd with ease, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries as though he belonged here. Which, of course, he did. This was his element, the arena where he thrived. For a moment, I considered slipping out unnoticed. But then our eyes met, and I froze, rooted to the spot. His lips curled into a faint smile, one that sent shivers down my spine. Without thinking, I set my glass down and strode toward him, determined not to let him intimidate me, even here in his territory. "Olivia," he said smoothly as I approached, his tone dripping with faux warmth. "Fancy seeing you here." I could say the same, I replied coolly, crossing my arms over my chest. "What are you doing here?" He shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Networking. Philanthropy. You know, the usual." "Funny," I said, narrowing my eyes. "I didn't realize you cared about anything besides yourself." His smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "That's harsh. Especially coming from someone who spent the last few months trying to ruin my life." "Ruin your life?" I laughed bitterly. "You did that yourself the moment you told me you didn't need me anymore. All I've done is survive." His gaze hardened, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of the old Mark, the man I used to love, buried beneath layers of greed and entitlement. "You think this is survival?" he asked quietly. "Buying my house, locking me out, playing games with my money? That's not surviving, Olivia. That's revenge. And sooner or later, it'll eat you alive." His words struck a nerve, resonating with fears I'd been suppressing for months. Was he right? Had I allowed my anger to consume me, to define me in ways I hadn't realized? I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the lump in my throat made it impossible to speak. Before I could respond, he leaned in closer, his voice low and urgent. "Let's end this. Take the deal. Walk away. You don't need me, either, not like this." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving me standing there, clutching my empty champagne flute and grappling with emotions I couldn't untangle. Revenge had felt empowering at first, a way to reclaim control over a situation that had spun wildly out of my grasp. But now, faced with the reality of what it had cost me, the sleepless nights, the constant vigilance, the erosion of my own peace, I wasn't so sure anymore. Was holding on to the mansion worth the toll it was taking on my sanity? Or was it time to let go, to find a way forward that didn't involve him at all? I didn't have answers yet. But as I stood there, surrounded by strangers in a glittering ballroom, I knew one thing for certain: whatever choice I made next, it had to be mine, and mine alone. That night, I returned to the mansion and stood in the grand foyer, staring at the walls that had become both my refuge and my prison. The weight of everything, Mark's betrayal, my revenge, the life we'd lost, pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. I realized then that keeping the mansion wasn't about winning anymore, it was about holding on to pain I didn't deserve to carry. The next morning, I called my lawyer and instructed her to sell the house. When Mark heard, he didn't gloat or celebrate. Instead, he showed up uninvited, his face unreadable as he watched movers pack away the remnants of a life we'd shared. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally, his voice softer than I'd heard in years. Because I'm done, I replied simply. You don't get to define me. As the movers drove away, I walked out of the mansion for the last time, leaving behind not just the house but also the anger that had bound me to him. For the first time in months, I felt free. Weeks later, I moved into a small cottage by the sea, its simplicity a balm to my weary soul. There, surrounded by crashing waves and endless horizons, I began to rebuild, not the life Mark had destroyed, but one entirely my own. And though scars remained, they no longer controlled me. I had survived, not because of him, but despite him.